year, more than 10,000 people in the United States alone are killed by environmentally induced cancers. What is the connection between human cancer and environmental contamination? We'll continue our discussion. Let's take note with Dr. Robert Proctor, Penn State Distinguished Professor of the History of Science and author of Cancer Wars: How Politics Shapes What We Know and Don't Know About Cancer, and The Nazi War on Cancer, published by Princeton Press. And joining us by telephone from Cornell University in Ithaca, New York, is Dr. Sandra Steingraber, biologist, ecologist, and author of Living Downstream, published by Vintage Books. Thank you both so much for being with us.
Thank you.
You've said, Dr. Steingraber, that lifestyle is the bullseye of cancer prevention. Why do we spend so much time talking about cancer prevention as something that we can change if we change our lifestyle?
Well, I think probably there's a good cultural reason. I think in the United States we like to think of ourselves as captains of our own ship, in charge of our own destiny. And there are a lot of big social, historical, political factors that also shape our lives that we somehow don't just give as much attention to. So that's why I wanted to write Living Downstream, to take a look at the exposures that may be creating cancer risks in all of us that we don't have individual control over, but we could do something about politically as a society, as citizens working together. How much
emphasis or how much pull do activists like Sandra Steingraber have in how we approach cancer?
Well, of course, activists are very important in raising people's consciousness, and that ultimately is the thing that's needed, because presently many of our cancer decisions are made by people who either have purely research as an interest or are interested more really in protecting the way things are now rather than cleaning up. So I guess that's the big problem now, is how little attention is being given to prevention when we know that at least half of all cancers could be prevented.
Dr. Steingraber, you said that breast cancer, the most common cancer among women, can't be explained by lifestyle factors. How then can it be explained?
Well, breast cancer actually presents us with one of the most vexing problems when we're looking at cancer causation, and we truly don't know. We have some very interesting clues that the environment is playing some kind of role, but we really haven't worked out the biological details yet. For example, when rats are exposed to a very powerful carcinogen called dioxin, in utero, when these female rats are still fetuses, they won't develop breast cancer. But when adults, after their mammary glands have formed, if we expose them to a second carcinogen, they go on to develop breast cancer, whereas rats only exposed as adults without that first initiating exposure as fetuses, they don't develop breast cancer either. So it's not a simple matter of how much DDT were you exposed to as a child, or when did you get your first period, or what kind of cancer genes that you have. The breast cancer puzzle seems to be a story about our genetics and our reproductive and lactational history all interacting with this whole kaleidoscope of environmental carcinogens. So what I'm really interested in as a woman and a mother now is to get all the chemicals that we think are associated with breast cancer out of the environment and out of women's bodies to lower our burden of breast cancer.
I think the enormous challenge is not only are there more chemicals out there today, but in combinations that no one ever tested, certainly. You know, as they become contaminants through rain or whatever, they end up together and creating new chemicals.
Well, that's right, and there's a brand new study out actually showing that when you mix chemicals together and then apply them to breast cancer cells growing in the laboratory, you get cancer-like cell growth in ways that when you just apply individual chemicals that you don't. And looking at mixtures really swamps the ability of science to ask and answer good questions. Of course, science works better when you change one variable against a background of constancy, but our real-life exposures is this multiple exposures of kaleidoscopes of chemicals, which I think is why we really need to act in a very precautionary way when we look at these issues.
I want to follow up on that term precautionary, but first I want to talk with Dr. Proctor a moment. The government has spent more than $30 billion on research to fight cancer. How, in your opinion, might we actually win this war on cancer?
Well, one of the easy things would be to stop the massive world promotion of cigarettes. Cigarettes cause about 1/3 of all cancers, meaning by that if cigarettes didn't exist, you'd have 1/3 fewer cancers. cigarettes kill at least 170,000 Americans every year. So this is by far and away the single most easy thing you could do, and yet still tobacco is available in the United States at much cheaper than most countries in the world. So why is this? So for one thing that needs to be done is much higher taxes on tobacco, restrictions on the kinds of things people can put in tobacco, broader programs to stop the export of tobacco. Now, it's interesting that only about 10% of cigarettes produced in this country are actually smoked in this country. So we are now in the process of exporting a massive world cancer epidemic, and it would be very simple to stop, but it's a political problem.
But you're talking about something that we can choose to smoke or not smoke. What Dr. Steingraber is talking about are contaminants that we might have a right to know they're out there, but we had nothing to do with putting them there, except that as consumers perhaps we contribute to their being there.
No, that's true, but the issue of choice is also a question in tobacco because people are addicted. It's generally speaking easier to quit using heroin than it is to quit smoking. A lot of people who begin smoking are children, and so the issue of choices is actually a complicated one in all of these cases. After all, people could choose to put less pesticide on their lawns, but they don't. There's obviously cultural pressure there too.
You mentioned this precautionary principle a moment ago, Dr. Steingraber. You know, many claim that the links between cancer and the environment are unproven or unprovable, but you say whether that's the case or not, you advocate what you call a precautionary principle, meaning that the indication of harm rather than the proof of it should be the trigger for action. Explain that a little bit more if you would.
Well, I guess it's a fancy way of saying what our mothers and grandmothers have told us a long time, which is you should be better safe than sorry, and you should get out of the swimming pool when lightning strikes, whether or not you have absolute proof the lightning will actually hit you or not. So it argues that people should not be in harm's way when we're uncertain about something. And I think the cigarette story that Dr. Proctor is talking about is a great example of that. The Surgeon General first announced in 1964 that smoking caused lung cancer, but the absolute proof for that connection actually came only in 1996, when we finally discovered the actual chemical in tobacco smoke and that mutated the actual gene, a gene called P53, and how that alteration actually creates a lung tumor to form.
So
imagine if
we wasted a lot of
that
time
long to warn people.
And in fact, according to your new book, in Germany they knew that there was a link to cancer back in the 40s.
Yeah, the actual medical consensus is first established in Germany in the 1930s. That smoking is the major cause of lung cancer, and that was completely ignored until 20 years later in the United States.
Interesting. You not only advocate this precautionary principle, Dr. Steingraber, but also reverse onus and least toxic alternative. Could you describe those in more detail?
Well, reverse onus means that rather than asking the public to prove that something is harming them by documenting that people are getting sick and dying because of exposure to particular chemicals, the burden of proof should really belong on those who seek to introduce new chemical into the environment to demonstrate that these almost certainly won't harm anyone. And going along with that, the idea that if there is a non-toxic alternative that's safer, then we should always opt for that over the toxic way of doing something. I think dry cleaning is a great example here. I happen to grow up drinking dry cleaning fluid in my drinking water wells. Whether or not that had anything to do with the fact I got bladder cancer at age 20, I'll never be able to answer that question. But I can say that there's a new technology called wet cleaning that can clean wool suits and beautiful silk blouses just as easily and just as cheaply and just as conveniently as dry cleaning. But it doesn't allow toxic chemicals to expose workers and go into the environment. So I'm interested in how we can switch over our economy into non-toxic alternatives and break our dependency on cancer-causing chemicals.
The kind of sea change that Dr. Steingraber is talking about would require an enormous change, an enormous political and public will, and I'm wondering, from your experience as a cancer historian, what it would take to muster up that kind of political and public will.
Well, I think we're seeing these positive moves already in more more fuel-efficient cars that are less polluting. There are all kinds of small steps. I mean, these are all steps that can be taken one at a time. Even the move towards something like a hydrogen burning fuel car that would release only water as exhaust would be a step. we'll see these things eventually, and it's just a matter of people taking them very seriously. One problem has been that cancer research has been defined always in terms of looking for the ever finer mechanisms of how cancer develops, rather than looking at what we could change in our environment or our lifestyle or what we produce that would actually prevent cancer. And if we focus more on that practical issue, how can we actually develop strategies and policies for reducing cancer, I think that's really what the cancer research should be all about.
If you could have Dr. Steingraber, what would you be telling them if you had their ear?
Well, I agree very much with Dr. Proctor. I think I would tell them that I'm seeing the signs as I travel around downstream of kind of a big burgeoning civil rights movement of different organizations, sometimes mothers of children with pediatric cancers, workers with testicular cancer, farmers with lymphoma, all who are organizing support groups and being very political. And I think the connection between the health of the environment and human health is the new human rights issue of the 21st century. And I would want cancer researchers to know that there's a kind of new civil rights movement that's growing that is really looking toward meaningful prevention and a cleaner environment.
You know, the federal right to know laws make it possible for us to get our hands on information about things that are contaminating our environment that we were never able to do in the past. How would you suggest we use that right to know?
Well, I think that with the right to know comes the obligation to investigate. So we need to take advantage of the fact that a lot of citizens fought hard and long to change what used to be proprietary information and trade secrets that industry could hold tightly, that is really all about their release into the public of toxic and cancer-causing chemicals. So we can easily find out that information. And when I wrote my book, it took 8 or 9 months for me to do that kind of investigation for my hometown. I'm pleased to say that anyone can go online and find out that kind of information in 5 minutes. But one great website to start with is one called www.scorecard.org, scorecard.org. You could type in your own zip code, and it will give you all the list of toxic emissions data that you have the right to know about, tell you who's emitting them into your community and what amounts and what health effects are known from these toxics.
I'm going to have to stop you right there. Thanks so much for being with us. Thank you so much, Dr. Robert Proctor from Penn State. We've been talking about cancer and the environment. Our guests have been Sandra Steingraber, author of Living Downstream. For Take Note, I'm Patty Satalia.
A copy of the program you've just seen can be purchased through Penn State Media Sales at mediasales.psu.edu or by calling 800-770-2111.